Hi, I'm Leanpub from Leanpub, and in this episode of the Front Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing Pavel Yosifovich. Based in New Jersey, Pavel is a developer, trainer, speaker, and book author. You can follow him on Twitter at Zodiacon and check out his website at scorpiosoftware.net. Pavel is the author of the Leanpub book, Windows Kernel Programming, 2nd edition. In the book, Pavel describes software kernel drivers, programming for Windows. This 2nd edition expands on existing topics and adds chapters on advanced programming techniques and the Windows filtering platform. In this interview, we're going to talk about his background and career, professional interests, his book, and at the end, we'll talk a little bit about his experience as a book author. So thank you very much, Pavel, for being on the Leanpub Front Matter podcast.
Happy to be here.
I always have to start these interviews by asking people for what I sort of jokingly call their origin story. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you grew up and, how you found yourself interested in a career in computers and technology.
Well, I actually was born in the Soviet Union, what was once the Soviet Union, back in 1971. Maybe you should edit that part out. Just kidding. And then when I was 2, we immigrated to Israel. So I lived most of my life in Israel, actually. I've been in the US only for the past 6 months or so. And I remember that when I was kind of 12, and there was the kind of an out curriculum activity after school that talked about something called computers. I really had no idea what that thing really meant. And then I got that, I went there and there was these ZX Spectrum. It was one of the first 8-bit computers back in the early 80s. And I was just hooked. I mean, it was possible to tell that box to do stuff. It was never objecting to anything. I could run a loop for a million times. It didn't complain about anything. So it was kind of magical to me. And since then, I've looked at software development as like kind of magic. You're creating something out of nothing. And I think this is what still keeps me interested in software many years later, because it is kind of magical and creating something out of nothing. And that's really the gist of it.
And were you able to get your own computer when you were still a teenager?
Yeah. A couple of years later, I got a Texas Instruments machine. It was 16-bit, which was very revolutionary at the time, but it actually was a pretty slow machine. It was slower than other 8-bit machines, but of course, I had no idea about these differences, so couldn't really figure out why things are the way they are. But I learned the basic language, which was very popular at the time, and I thought, that's the greatest language in the world. I don't need anything else. Well, little did I know. But it was kind of, just magic. I was writing these simple games. I really liked games. I liked playing at the time, and I always also liked writing them, creating these kind of games using that machine, and later on the Commodore 64 machine, the fairly famous one. I had that most of my teenage career, so to speak, and still sometimes miss it. It was really magical for its day at the very least.
And I see from your LinkedIn profile that you studied computer science at university.
Well, actually, I studied electrical engineering.
Oh, did you?
Not computer science specifically. I thought that studying too much math would make me crazy. So I decided to go in a more broader sense to electronics and things like that. But software was always my passion. I really always thought of myself as a software developer, creator. And it's good to have the background, which is more general or generic than just pure computer science. You have that broader perspective. You also can talk about hardware and things like that, which the typical software developer perhaps doesn't have the proper background, because that one was studying pure computer science, which is very common.
Yeah, that's a topic, actually, the sort of what to study and things like that is a topic that's come up on this podcast a number of times, which leads me to ask a question I've asked many times before of guests, which is, if you were starting out now with an intention of having a career like the one you've had, would you go to university and spend 4 years studying a formal?
Probably not. At the time, it was kind of almost required. My parents wanted me to learn and all that stuff, and I had to sort of do that, but it was very painful, actually. I found out that most people that went to study that computer engineering and electrical engineering, they weren't really interested in the topic, They just heard that in the high-tech field, there's a great salary. So they were just there to pass the test and move on. And beyond that, the actual material wasn't really, I would say, taught in an interesting fashion. It was all those professors, most of them, not all of them, but most of them were doing that because they had to. They didn't really have the teaching skills and nor the interest to provide that kind of interest or passion or reasoning. Why are we learning that? Not just to pass some test, but what's the rationale behind this? And I think this is a big problem in the entire education system, not just the university. But university, you go because you're supposed to want to go there. But if I had to do that again, probably wouldn't do that. It's just most of these 4 years were wastes of time, really.
And so you would find some, try boot camps or something like that, or just set up your own.
Yeah, I would be something which is more practical, more to the point, more being interested in what I'm actually studying. I think it starts with the teachers, with the professors, all of that. Their demeanor and the way they approach the subject is leaves lots to be desired, I would say.
Yeah, I think anyone listening, even I'm sort of more on the sort of I would go to university side of things, but we can all think about sort of bad professors that we had, and if you got stuck with quite a few of them, that can be just a miserable, not just waste of time, but miserable time to go through. And being able to sort of shop around and sort of switch from one platform to another, for example, is not something you can do in the conventional university structure. You're kind of committed at least for a year at a time, and moving around during your undergrad years is really frowned upon. So there's a lot of risks and constraints that come from a system like that. So in the mid to late 90s and very early 2000s, there was a huge .com boom in the States. It trickled into Canada and other places as well. Was there a .com boom in Israel?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it was kind of the same. Israel is very similar to the US in that respect. Everything trickles down to Israel pretty fast. And this is true even today. Israel is known as the startup nation, the most number of startups compared to the number of people in the country. So yeah, we had that. And we got that breakdown, that collapse of the .com boom, just like the US.
And were your first kind of jobs in sort of the web?
No, actually, I hate the web. I have to say, I really don't like the web. Well, at least at the beginning, my background was in client applications, working on the client and just trying to make the most of the machine that you have. And I feel that with web, you lose that kind of control. You're in the confines of the browser and you have server-side networking, all the stuff that constrains you, especially in the past. Today you have some more freedom with HTML5 and stuff like that. But at the time, it was pretty constrained, and I wouldn't call that very interesting, or I don't know. At least for me, it wasn't that interesting to do at the time.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Actually, when we get to talking about your book, we'll be talking about things like native apps and kernels and control and things like that. But just before we move on to the next part of the interview, I did want to ask, for some reason, sort of the kind of self-published authors that we get on Leanpub are sort of very independent types, and they move around a lot, and they often have stories about that kind of thing. So what brought you to move to the U.S. 6 months ago?
Well, it was just an opportunity to obtain an all kind of visa. All visa is for extraordinary abilities, or at least that's what the Americans have here. I believe that I have. So it was kind of a way to change atmosphere, to perhaps have new opportunities. My kids to have different schools, different environment. I mean, they were excited about the move, so we just kind of did it almost from today to tomorrow. Kind of in 2 months, we made the entire move, which was pretty crazy when you think about it now, and it still is crazy. But I think it's just kind of an adventure kind of thing, and see where it can go.
What's the most striking kind of culture shock experience that you've had?
Well, I am familiar with the US. I mean, I've visited the US many times, but really it's the calmness of things. I mean, everybody is pretty calm. I don't see any people, honking too much on the highways or getting too angry. There's space here. Israel is a fairly small country, and sometimes all the enemies that within without it's sometimes very stressful to some extent, and things are always kind of happening. Here it's much more relaxed. I mean, I'm much more relaxed than I used to be. There's nature outside my windows. So, I mean, I see trees. I mean, that's a nice thing. So generally, I would say the relaxation, the calmness, relatively speaking, I mean, the US is big. So if you really want to get into action, you have to drive really far to get some real action. So I like it.
Well, that's great to hear. I would say my personal sort of experience whenever I go to the States that always said I find striking coming from a sort of Canadian kind of culture is how simultaneously straightforward and friendly Americans typically are. So in Canada, it's like very unusual to be sitting next to someone in a bar and turn to them and start a conversation. That's actually just, at least in my experience, like quite rare. But if you do it and the person sitting next to you said, I don't want to talk, you would carry that resentment and insult with you forever as a Canadian, whereas an American would go, they'd try and start a conversation. If the guy said I didn't want to talk to you, oh, okay. No reason to expect you to, and they just both carry on with their lives as though nothing happened. So
that's a good distinction. I need to remember that next time when I'm in Canada.
Oh, yeah. Well, no one's going to get mad at you if you try and strike up a conversation, and especially if they can tell you're not from Canada, it won't bother them that much. But anyway, and I shouldn't speak for all Canadians, but I think that's pretty true. So just moving on to the next part of the interview where we're going to talk about your book, your latest book specifically. But when did you get into writing?
Well, I always liked to write, and at some point, I think it was in 2012, someone from Packet Publishing approached me and said, how about you write a book on WPF? You seem to know something about that, because I wrote a few blog posts about WPF, the Windows Presentation Foundation, a well-known old technology in Windows. And I said, well, sounds like a great idea. Let's just do that. That was kind of my first professional foray into authoring an actual book. And later on, I followed that with another book, and later still later in 2017, I finished the Windows Internals book, co-authored with some other guys like Alex Ionesco, and I would say my experience with official publishers weren't that great, and I have no idea. I didn't know what Leanpub was at the time, even though it existed. I had no idea it actually existed. But then someone just pointed me to Leanpub, and then I thought, that's like an ideal platform, or very close to ideal, because I can write at my own pace. I don't have to answer to anyone. No editor is breathing down my neck and saying, well, you should write this or that. It is my book. I'd like to write it in the way that I'd like to write it. So please stay out of it. And you also get higher royalties. So, I mean, it's kind of amazing. It was amazing to me at the time that with the official publishers, you get these, you work terribly hard to get this book out, and then your royalties are negligible. Most of the money goes to the publisher, which I always found like ridiculous. I'm doing all the work, or most of the work, and getting just a measly piece of the royalties, which doesn't make any sense. And once I realized that I could just write without anyone having to say anything, that was like kind of ideal. And the point is that I'm writing for myself. I'm not writing for others. If others find that content useful, that's a bonus. I'm just writing because I like to write. I like to express myself. I like to explain complex things in a simple manner. It's just something that I like to do. If others find it useful, all the best.
Yeah, just I'm curious a little bit about that. It's interesting, that sort of theme of control seems to be developing in our interview, that you like to be in control of things. But that is something we've heard a lot from authors over the years, that one of the reasons they're drawn to a self-publishing platform is they just want to be in control. And that can be true whether their experience with a conventional publisher was positive or negative. They can often be like, you know what, for this type of project, especially if you're writing for yourself, you don't need anyone breathing down your neck. You don't need, I mean, nowadays, if you want to pitch a trade book to a conventional publisher, they make you write like a 40-page business plan. And it's like, isn't that your job, you know? Increasingly, yeah, we do hear from people saying, you know, the value add from publishers. I mean, if you're going to be if you're aiming to be a celebrity, then often going with a conventional publisher can really help and things like that. But they have to choose to elevate you. They have to choose to put the marketing behind you. They have to choose all that kind of stuff, and that none of that's in your control. But yeah, so anyway, moving on to your book, Windows Kernel Programming, second edition. You published it in progress, and now it's I believe complete. So congratulations, that's great. So just to sort of talk about the book, let's sort of talk a little bit about the technical terms, which I sort of invoked earlier when you started talking about client and things like that. A lot of people hear client, they think I'm a consultant and I've got a client, but that's not the kind of client you're talking about.
No.
So what is, let's start with explaining, let's say, and I'm sure you get this question all the time, but you know, what is a kernel?
Well, the kernel is really the engine that powers up an operating system. If you think about what an operating system really is, its basic functionality is to allow other applications to run. So you want to run your notepad or whatever Word, wherever you're running, someone has to actually manage all the resources on the system. You want to use the disk, you want to use the screen, the mouse, and so on. Then you need some kind of management entity to take care of all of that. That's the kind of the basic role of a kernel. And that's why every OS must have a kernel.
And
yep.
And so, for example, so this sounds like a very important part of the computer.
Critical.
And is it easy to, like, I mean this in this specific sense of like just to access a kernel and start programming in it?
No, it's considered sometimes kind of black art, dark art that only magicians and wizards are trained in doing. And one of the reasons I wrote the Windows Kernel Programming book, the first edition, and the second one, is to dispel all that myth. So it's not that hard to do. You just need to know, and to get started, it might be a bit difficult if you have no particular background. It's very, very difficult to know where to start. The documentation is vast. Sometimes it actually is missing some pieces. So it's very difficult to know how to get started. And that's why I wrote this book. This is one of the reasons I wrote this book, to show that, in fact, it's not a black art. It's not only for all those selected few that perhaps went to some trials and tribulations. Anyone can actually do that if you have a proper basic background in language such as C and some basic understanding of operating systems. Then with the proper guidance, you can write kernel drivers, you can write kernel code. And specifically, I'm targeting Windows here, but the same ideas conceptually apply to other operating systems as well.
And for what reason would one want to write kernel code?
So I think one of the main reasons, at least in recent years, has to do with the security, the cybersecurity space. If you want to know when things happen in a very low level kind of way, in a way we can control things. For example, if a new process starts up, you can tell that it's happening. Then you can decide, hey, I don't like that process. I think it's running something that might be malicious. On the kernel side of things, I can say, let me just kill the process and not let it continue running. Something you cannot do for user mode, where you don't have that kind of power. So that would be one reason that is fairly common these days. Also, anything that relates to talking to hardware has to be done. Most of these things have to be done from the kernel side of things. If you have a device that you want to be able to talk to or to manage, this is mostly done by hardware vendors. So if Intel creates a network card, they have to write a device driver communicating with the kernel. Otherwise, this device is completely inoperational if it hasn't the correct code to interface with the rest of the kernel. That is also a very common scenario. And in general, if you want to do stuff that you can't do from user mode, kernel is your best bet. This is where you have all the power, the cell power the operating system has.
And do the people who make operating systems like the fact that there are people like you out there writing books telling people how to get into their kernel and program it?
Probably not, or at least not as you would hope. And there's one reason is perhaps a good one because when you're writing code within the kernel, you are part of the kernel now. Anything bad you're doing, you get that crash of the system. In Windows, it's fairly well known as the blue screen of death. And so in that case,
right.
When customers get that, they always say Microsoft is to blame. In most cases, actually, Microsoft is not to blame. It's actually whoever wrote the driver that caused the system to crash, which is usually some third-party vendor, which is not Microsoft. But of course, people have no idea about that. They know that Windows is made by Microsoft. So whenever they get the blue screen, they just blame Microsoft automatically. Obviously, Microsoft is not happy about people writing kernel drivers. They would like that to be the least amount of people doing that, making more instability or getting more potential instability into the kernel.
And so, who would the book be for? Would it be for people who are sort of brand new to this world, this scary world of kernels, or people who actually have been tasked with, like, you've got to do something, you've got to fix the blue screen on this client's machine or something like that?
So I try to address most developers that are in the kernel space, starting with new developers that want to get into kernel programming and they don't know how to do that, how to get started, what are the tools to use, and what do we have there. And I also target more experienced developers that already are working within the kernel, but they want to understand a bit deeper how things work and maybe learn new techniques. So I'm trying to cover basic stuff in the first few chapters, and then later on, I'm getting into more complex things and just to try to cover as much as I kind of can in a single book.
So even if someone's not sort of in the world of Windows, at least the first few chapters will actually be quite instructive for them, just learning the kind of basic principles and things like that?
Definitely. I talk about how the operating system is built a little bit and the foundations onto which Windows is built. So even if you're not writing drivers at all, even if you're only working in user mode, in user space, you get lots of insight as to how Windows actually works behind the scenes, which is always a good thing that main developers actually miss, in the sense that they think they're writing some kind of stuff in Node.js or JavaScript or these kinds of super high-level languages that they're controlling the world, but they actually have no idea how things actually work. And it's important, if you want to be a good developer, you need to have at least one or two layers of abstraction underneath, understood in some way. And that would make you a really good developer.
And this book is, of course, a second edition, as we mentioned. So what are some of the differences between the first edition and the second edition?
Okay, so the first edition, I was kind of rushing through it and writing really fast. I got the book pretty quickly out there. And I already knew I wanted to explain some more things and add more techniques that weren't yet official and would be later on be available in newer versions of Windows. So I knew I wanted to expand on existing chapters, which I did. So I added more examples and talked about some extra programming techniques that I didn't mention in the first edition, and also added some new chapters about the Windows filtering platform, which is a nice platform for network filtering, so you can see everything that's going on in terms of networking, and another chapter, a more modern framework for writing drivers called the Kernel Driver Framework. So try to kind of fill in the missing pieces from the first edition.
Thanks very much. That's great. It's I know I saw on Twitter that sort of people were really happy to see that it was finally finished. And that gives me a chance to segue to the last part of the interview where you talk about your work as the sort of nitty gritty of being a self-published author and writer and things like that. And so the book is up on Amazon in both the paperback and Kindle, I believe. And did you use our print ready PDF output feature to make the PDF that you needed for Amazon?
Yes, I did. So usually, many people tell me that they feel more comfortable to hold a physical book. And so I can definitely relate. There's something, I think, magical about a physical book and not just electronic one. And so once I have the book ready, I publish that on Amazon as well. And yes, I'm using the print ready feature.
Definitely. Oh, fantastic! Yeah, we recently launched something called Leanpub Author Services, where we'll do the same thing for people. We were, at least I'll speak for myself. I was a bit surprised at how much people really do like to get copies of Leanpub books in print. That was kind of just a blind spot that I had. I kind of, if you'd asked me the question, I would have given the right answer before having this experience. But it really, when we sort of saw the charts, it's like really brought it home, at least to me.
Yeah,
that
yeah, definitely. I mean, one of the benefits of electronic books is trying to save on trees and all that. But unfortunately, still people like to hold on books in their hands.
Oh yeah, definitely. And in particular, actually, if one of the purposes of self-publishing a book is to sort of increase your profile, if you're an independent consultant or something like that, actually like having physical books to give or send people is like extremely useful. Or if you're, and of course, if you're speaking at a conference, having a pile of books that you schlep with you, is really useful too. The last question that I always like to ask on the podcast, if the guest is a Leanpub author, is if in your time using Leanpub, if there was one thing that just always had you shaking your fist at the screen and yelling at Leanpub over, or if there was one magical feature we could build for you, is there anything you can think of that you would like us to do?
Well, I guess more flexibility in fonts would be nice. I think it always I see the list is a bit limited. And sometimes I can't get exactly the font that I would like. Well, that's one thing.
Okay. Yeah, no, thanks for that feedback. That's really good. For anyone listening who is a Leanpub author is thinking of being one, when you make a Leanpub book, there's a theme section where you can choose various settings. And if you have a custom theme, there's font drop downs for like the title font, and the body font and things like that. And that list, I believe, is not even in alphabetical order currently. And it doesn't sort of show you what we have.
Exactly.
We have a Help Center article that shows you, but you'd have to go there and scroll down and look to see examples of what those text looks like. So it's not like in Microsoft Word, for example, where you choose font and the font is in the font. The font name is in the font itself, which would be a really great feature to have. So, and I totally see the value in that and appreciate that. Pavel, thank you very much for taking some time out of your day to talk to me and to talk to our audience. And thank you very much for being a Leanpub author.
Thank you, Len. I really appreciate the platform. And thank you for creating it. I mean, I wouldn't know what I would do without it.
Thanks.